Okay, welcome everyone for the fifth and final edition of the year of Discourse Seminar Series. I'm Lena Palaniappan. It's a pleasure to host the last session of the year. We've had a successful run this year. We had really a lot of interest in the seminar series. So it's great to have you all back. A lot of you are coming back. Some of you may be new. So I'll spend a few minutes introducing the speakers today and also the idea of seminar series for the next year as well. And please remember, this meeting is getting recorded. So it'll be great if you switch off, mute your microphones until the discussion starts. When the discussion starts, you'll be called out if you want to speak, or you can put your questions on the chat box as well. At that time, you can unmute yourself. So this is Discourse Seminar Series. And just an update, we have around 116 registered members within the consortia right now. And we also have several active programs going on. One of the things is the speech bank. We have around 26 sites interested in collecting data, and at least 7 of them have started collecting data to put in a data bank, speech data. We successfully managed to harmonize a speech protocol for data acquisition as well over the year. So despite what the virus has done to all of us, we've had a reasonable run this year. I'll tell you more about that as we go along. And this is the series, as many of you know. We've started it this summer in August 2021. We've had 4 talks on a monthly basis so far, and this is the final talk of the year. And this is going to be given by Professor Gina Cooperberg and Professor Deborah Titon, who are not new to a lot of us working in this field. I'll start with introducing Professor Gina Kuperberg. Gina is a Dennett Stiebel Professor of Cognitive Science at Tufts, and she's a psychiatrist in the Department of Psychiatry at MGH. She has crossed the pond, just like me. I crossed the pond much later, but she crossed the pond many years ago. She did her MD at St. Bart's in London, and then did her PhD in psychology and cognitive neuroscience at King's College at the IOP, the University of London. She did her psychiatric residency and a fellowship at the IOP at Maudsley, and did research fellowships after this in neuroimaging and electrophysiology at the Martino Center at MGH. She's still attached to these institutions. And Gina is very well known in this area. She received the Bennett Research Award in biological psychiatry, the Joseph Zubin Award in psychopathology, and also an award for blind research for the most cited paper on language comprehension, and many more laurels in the field of examining language in psychosis. Her work focuses on cognitive neuroscience aspects of language and also thought and meaning. She'll tell you more about her work in a minute, but the discussion will be led by Professor Deborah Titon. Deb is a professor of psychology and currently associate vice principal of research at McGill, and she holds a Tri-Council Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Language and Multilingualism. She's very interested in sociocultural and experiential factors that affect language processing in laboratory settings, the linguistic landscape in general, and also using network science. Her lab is on the forefront of developing how bilingualism and social networks impact the processing of L1 and L2, language 1 and language 2, and cognitive functions such as executive control as well. She has made long-standing contributions to the study of language and schizophrenia, starting from the time she was a researcher in the psychology research lab at McLean at Boston. I guess Gina and Deb know each other from those times. Maybe they'll tell us more on that. In collaborations with Dr. Phil Holzman, Deborah Levy, and others, who many of us know, led a number of works on rating language and thought disorder and schizophrenia in early years. Her current work on language and schizophrenia pertains to skilled reading in people with schizophrenia, in collaboration with the trainees, as well as Drs. Veronica Whitford and Gillian O'Driscoll. And that lab is situated in Montreal. So as we know, the seminar structure is the same. We'll have around 50 minutes of talk, followed by 15 to 20 minutes, generally led by the discussant. The discussant will summarize the issues at hand and will lead the audience towards questions as well. And there will be open discussion after that. You can use the chat box to put your questions. You can ask to speak online as well if you want to come online. The event is being recorded, so make sure that your microphone is muted throughout the course of the talk. I also want to take a moment to thank a lot of people who helped us to put this seminar series together this year. A lot of help from Natalia Mota, who co-led this seminar idea this year with me. Natalia should be somewhere in the audience today. I also have to thank Eric Tan, Gina as well, part of the steering committee group, and Iris Sommer, and Maria Francisca, who's working with me here, Wolfram Hinzen, and Emery Bora. This is the group behind, this steering group behind the work that you're seeing and part of Discourse. Thank everyone for this. And there's also going to be more activities next year. Just bring this up before I forget. There's this Florence SARS meetup that we are planning, if the virus permits, and I'll keep you posted on that as we see what unfolds. We also have 2 discourse symposia at SARS in April. One is on returning to linguistic roots of psychosis, advancing knowledge to international collaboration. This is led by Natalia Mora. This will present some of the exciting work going on in many places across the world. We'll have Alberto Parola, Eric Tan, Sunny Tang, and Natalia as well presenting. And then we have a second symposia focused on how can we progress in terms of treatments for thought and language dysfunction and psychosis. This is therapeutic pathways, which I'm chairing, and we have a lot of interesting speakers, including Iris Sommer, Frederick Stein from Thilo Kirch's group, Gillinder Bedi from Origin in Australia, Iris, as I said, and Enzo Tagliazucchi. He's working on psychedelics and speech, and Cheryl Corcoran as well. So if you are at SARS, please keep these 2 symposia in mind. It'll be fantastic to catch up. And also just a reminder that the special issue for Schizophrenia Bulletin, the submission date is pushed back to 31st of March 2022 now. This is the final pushback, and we won't have any more changes in deadlines. So if you're preparing something for the special issue, please submit before 31st of March. And I'm happy to correspond with you if you have any queries around that. Finally, we're also planning for another series of discourse seminars, and that's supposed to start from the month after SOURCE seminar, which will be from May next year. And currently, Eric Tan and Natalia Mota are spearheading the plans for this. So if you have any ideas of how to contribute, or if there's any other opinions on the seminar series, please reach out to both of them. We'll be happy to include you in the discussions as well. So without any more ado, I'm going to pull off the screen and call Gina to bring up her talk. Gina?
Hi. Okay, can you all see my screen? Okay, thank you, Lena, for the lovely introduction. I'm just going to see if I can make this a bit smaller. That's better. So I'm going to be, like all of you in this series, talking about language and schizophrenia. And, you know, I guess this needs no introduction to this particular group. But normally I actually have to justify why I study language and schizophrenia. And to that question, I usually sort of say, why would I not? I mean, schizophrenia is a severe neurodevelopmental disorder that's characterized by thought, cognitive, and social communication dysfunction. And language is the cognitive system that humans have evolved to be able to communicate their thought. And so I'll follow in the footsteps of Eugene Bleuler by thinking about language as a way to understand a mechanism of cognition and thought in schizophrenia. Okay, so language is pretty amazing. We can have thoughts in our brains and literally transmit them to other brains through a code. And so one has to ask, how do you get from an event like there being a little baby inside the crib, how do you get there from sort of sensory and perceptual inputs? And of course, all of you know that we do this through using multiple levels of linguistic representation, which I've sort of depicted very schematically here: syntax, semantics, phonology, orthography, amongst others, each with their own hierarchical structures. And all these levels of themselves have hierarchical structures. So we go from sublexical representations to lexical representations to whole event structures. And when we process or produce language online, it's really important to recognize that although these are distinct representations, at least we can describe them as such, they interact enormously quickly, sort of really as the words are coming in to produce meanings. And moreover, we do this not only interactively, but also incrementally. And what that means is that as this woman is speaking, or as we're reading, we're building up the meaning of the sentence as we go along. And similarly, as we're producing, only the other way around. And so I will spare you pictures like this throughout this talk, but I'm going to really simplify here. And most of the talk is going to be focusing on the event level representation and lexicosemantic level of representation. Most, but not all, we're presenting through written words, just for ease of experimental control. And because of this incrementality as well as interactivity, and because these levels of representation encode information at different time spans, what this means, I think it's as a byproduct of incrementality as well as interactivity, is that the brain can actually predict information, and here lexicosemantic information, for example, the meaning of the word baby that's associated with that word, before the bottom-up input actually appears. And I'm just going to showcase some very exciting work from our lab recently by Lin Wang in collaboration with Ollie Jensen, where we found that we could actually decode those representations in healthy adults through unique spatial patterns and also unique temporal patterns before the bottom-up input actually appears. I will say, though I've been studying language and psychosis for many, many years, when Lena said, you've gone to the dark side, I actually thought he meant, I've also been doing a lot of work on just healthy adults. So I'm sort of giving you a little bit of context in that sense. So, because we can predict so rapidly and generate these top-down predictions, that begs the question of what actually happens when, during incremental language processing, here I'm talking about comprehension, what happens when we actually encounter a word, and whether the brain assesses that word in the light of these predictions. And it turns out that it does. And we can measure this through a technique known as event-related potentials, in which we can extract neural activity from the scalp surface, and through a process of signal averaging, we can extract ERP waveforms. And I'm going to be focusing here on one ERP waveform known as the N400, which is exquisitely sensitive to sentence meaning, word meaning, both in and out of context. But what I want you to notice here is this N400, which is called of 400 because it peaks at around 400 milliseconds. This waveform is actually fairly small to words that are very predictable when you've already predicted them prior to that word actually appearing. However, if I said in the playground there was a little baby, that it's not completely unpredictable, but it's semi-predictable. And there we're probably going to generate probabilistic predictions with baby with sort of less than 99% probability. And the N400 is going to be medium-sized. Finally, if you haven't predicted an incoming word at all, or if you violate a prediction, then the N400 is going to be much larger. But it's important to notice that the amplitude of the N400 is really kind of sensitive to the predictability of incoming words. And that's been shown by my group as well as many others, that it's sensitive, its amplitude is sensitive to the predictability of incoming words, not only in sentence context, but also in simple semantic priming paradigms, such as this one. And you can see its amplitude is modulated in a graded fashion, and also in discourse paradigms, such as this one. But, you know, again, modulated in a graded fashion. But more recently, we've been getting really excited about thinking about the N400 through a different lens, not only as a neural signature of the ease of accessing an incoming word in relationship to prior predictions, but also as a direct neural measure of prediction error. Now, I don't say that lightly, because I've been sort of writing and speaking about prediction in the brain and language comprehension for many, many years. But it's only recently where I've really sort of begun to think seriously about this framework in relationship to the N400, largely because these very talented people, Sama Nuruddin, who's a graduate student in my lab, together with Trevor Brothers, Lin Wang, also in my lab in collaboration with Mike Spratling in London, we have actually instantiated the very first model of lexicosemantic processing, which is using the same predictive coding architecture that was first developed in the visual system. And here I'm depicting event level representation, which was at the top of the model, lexicosemantic, and sort of lower level. And here we're instantiating the predictive coding computational model. And I want you to note these little sort of hats on the top of every representation. Those are all important because one of the fundamental claims of this predictive coding algorithm is the idea that there are separate error units, which basically subtract any prediction from the current state to produce prediction error. And this prediction error is the information that is passed up the hierarchy. And so what Sam did was he presented the model with sort of 20 iterations of pre-activation, and then gave the model bottom-up input. And what you can see here is that if the prediction is very strong, then the difference between the current state computed as the model as the input passes up the model and this prediction is going to produce only a very, very small prediction error. And what you can do is you can give the model different levels of predictability and different words which are predictable or not. And then as the model converges, then it's going to then switch off the lower level prediction error. So the idea is that prediction error is always being computed, passed up the network until higher levels converge, at which point they will then switch off lower level prediction error. And I think what really sort of convinced me is that in these simulations, we basically showed that there've been other computational models of the N400, but none that can do anything like this. Basically, this really nice graded effect. It even simulates the time course of the N400. I will also say that Sam's, the N400 isn't only sensitive to prior context, it's also sensitive to any number of lexical factors. And Sam's actually shown that this model basically produces those effects can simulate those effects. So I think there's reason to sort of start thinking about this waveform that we can measure at the scalp surface as possibly a direct index of lexicosemantic prediction error that's produced in the surface of probabilistic inference in the brain. And in other work, we've source localized this effect to various regions within the left temporal cortex. So then, the moment you've all been waiting for, what happens in schizophrenia? We've been doing this for a number of years, and I will say that when you have semi-automatic semantic priming, the N400 effect is pretty normal in schizophrenia. It's really no different from that in healthy adults. Same in many sentence comprehension paradigms. When you've got sort of simple sentences, such as every morning at breakfast, the boys would eat versus plant, then you get a normal N400 effect in patients relative to controls, which would seem to suggest that these top-down prediction processes are functioning pretty normally, and that the prediction error, if you take the N400 amplitude to reflect that, is actually normal to sentences in isolation. So, maybe we should all go home. And, I've sort of told you the story, but not so fast. So I've been telling you about these sort of sentences that really are in isolation of any broader context. And that, I think, is all important, because we never produce and comprehend language in isolation of context. So when this woman or this brain is speaking and she's saying in the crib there was a little baby, she probably has in mind any number of things, the mother just about to come in, this cute baby in the crib, nursery, baby playing, and this comprehender has absolutely no idea what she's talking about, but she has to infer this from what the woman is saying. So she might say, oh, cute. Then this brain will say, well, the baby started crying. So she's building up this picture of the baby and the nursery and this particular, what I'm going to call situation. But then, and we know this happens all the time in conversations, when we're listening to the radio, topics can change, and they can change very suddenly. So if this woman says, hey, what are you doing for the holidays? Then she may have in her brain this whole sort of situation of the holidays, but this brain now needs to basically infer a whole new set of situations that may be related to the upcoming Christmas holidays. And what I want you to sort of note is that, these events in these situations, they cluster together. And we can represent that in the mind schematically as sort of whole situations. And so it's not true that, language is only about sort of building event meaning or communicating event meaning. These events are situated in broader contexts. And what's important is that in healthy adults, we know that these situations generally remain fairly stable. All of you are now in a Zoom talk. So if I suddenly say, hey, what are you doing this holidays? I think you'd be fairly surprised. But, I'm hopefully sticking to my assigned topic of language and schizophrenia. And you expect me to sort of stay there. So you have this fairly stationary expectation. But when I've done with the Zoom talk, then, we might be talking about Christmas, going out, skiing if we're really lucky, or any number of things. We'll sort of switch topics. The point is that while we're in a particular topic, we have a fairly high certainty about that topic, and it has to, and we have to get quite a lot of input to shift us away. But shift away we can, and then we go to other topics. So I really want to emphasize this sort of cluster, this particular kind of statistical structure of these kinds of sort of situations that we talk about when communicating in the real world. And so now when we sort of come to think about predictive coding, or more generally hierarchical generative processing and frameworks within within situational context, then we can add this additional level, and we can start sort of thinking about generating predictions not only from the events we want to communicate, but also based on these higher level sort of situations. And what that's going to mean is that the amplitude of any prediction error in broader discourse context is actually going to be even smaller than it would do in a given sentence context. Really, that's driven by a high certainty about the current situation. And so you can see, like in this study, then some things that are discourse predictable produce very small N400s. And I've shown you before that those effects localized to the left temporal cortex. In contrast, if we're all in a nursery scene and we suddenly hear about the holidays, then the prediction error produced here, and for the first time, the higher level event prediction error, is going to be much larger. Because it's not going to be so easily explained and switched off by the context, or by higher level predictions. So you can see that the N400 becomes large. You can see this actually even more clearly on MEG. And this is MEG source localization, where you see an enhancement between 300 and 500 milliseconds, which is the N400 time window, an enhancement of activity within left temporal cortex. And for the very first time, you're also seeing activity in the left inferior prefrontal cortex. So what happens in schizophrenia? Well, now for the very first time, we actually see reductions of the N400. So here in healthy adults, when you've got a fairly unpredictable word, like if you just said out of the blue, if it was wilting by Sunday, or even if you said the plant was wilting by Sunday, then that word by itself is in the local sentence context is not so predictable. But when it's discourse congruous, then it is more predictable, and the N400 is small and larger when it's incongruous. But in patients, for the first time, there's very little difference in activity. And for those of you, as I mentioned, most of these studies are done with written language comprehension, the ones that I'm presenting you, but there's huge amounts of work on the N400 and spoken language comprehension. I've never really seen them diverge, at least for the sort of very basic contextual effects. And this is work by Tamara Swab and her team, showing once again that the N400 effect in discourse context, at least to words that are plausible but relatively unpredictable in local sentence context, the difference in this activity is smaller in schizophrenia, and this was done just in naturalistic spoken language comprehension. So I think there's some evidence, at least, that the N400 is relatively insensitive to the effects of broader discourse context, even though it's quite sensitive to local sentence contexts. So what does this mean? So here's a hypothesis. As I said, in healthy adults, we're not only sort of predicting based on events, we're also predicting on the basis of the broader visual scene, as well as discourse scene, if it's painted by another person we're speaking to. So in general, the amplitude of any lexico-semantic prediction error produced by an incoming word is going to be pretty small. But in people with schizophrenia, a failure to predict very strongly on the basis of current discourse scene, that doesn't mean to say they can't use it, but the failure to proactively use the broader situation to predict upcoming events will then filter down, leading to a failure to suppress lower level prediction error. And so in general, prediction error will be larger within the left temporal cortex in people with schizophrenia, at least between 300 and 500 milliseconds, the N400 time window. But if we suddenly say there was a brick in the middle of a nursery scene, then, as I said before, the N400 will be even more enhanced, and you'll start to see prefrontal activity, which we associate with event level prediction error because it can't be explained away by the current scene. But in schizophrenia, now instead of being larger than expected, it's smaller than expected, both at the lexico-semantic level as well as the event level. So now I'm just going to explore some of the consequences Are you still there? Everyone just disappeared.
Yep, we're here.
Okay. Can you see me? Okay,
Yes,
so I'm
I
just
can
going to
hear you.
explore some of the consequences for this. So I've sort of suggested to you that perhaps some of the language abnormalities that arise in schizophrenia may come from a reduced certainty about the broader situation, and therefore a failure to actually use that very, very quickly online and proactively to basically boost top-down predictions to the lexicosemantic level. And that may lead to a failure to suppress lexicosemantic prediction error produced within the temporal cortex. So that would mean that there'd be a sort of a sustained increase in lexicosemantic prediction error, and particularly to words that are relatively associated as opposed to unassociated, or predictable as opposed to relatively unpredictable. And, you know, as I was preparing for this talk, you know, one of the things I was trying to do is look back many years I've been in this field, and it sort of made me sort of think about some of our earlier findings where that's indeed what we showed. You know, we've showed both in semantic priming paradigms under controlled conditions, as well as in broader context, that if anything, you get enhanced activity in patients within regions of the temporal cortex associated with lexicosemantic processing. But what I want to explore, which I think is kind of, you know, potentially really interesting, is another consequence of that. And that is consequences for longer term learning, because there's a really close relationship between prediction error, uncertainty, and learning. And I want to just at least hypothesize the idea that this uncertainty about the broader situation in combination with sustained increases in lexicosemantic prediction error may actually account for or lead to noisy lexical representation. So let me explain what I mean by that. So, you know, gone are the days when we used to think about language processing and language learning as completely different. I think there's a lot of evidence that they're very, very tightly interlinked. It's not like we finish learning language in adulthood. We're constantly adapting to our communicative environment. And our communicative environment will include sort of the broader context. So this is not in discourse context. This is the broader context in this case is basically the predictive validity of a really simple semantic priming paradigm. But in one block, the predictive validity, in other words, the likelihood that you would get a related as opposed to an unrelated word pair is going to be fairly small, whereas in another block, then the predictive validity is going to be much higher. What's really important is that, you know, no one tells us that the environment has, in this case, no one's telling us that the environment sort of changed, it sort of just changed. So basically people had to adapt from this low predictability to high predictability, and indeed healthy adults did. You know, you get this really big adaptation effect on the N400 such that you start to predict more when you believe that there's utility in predicting. And this is work done a few years ago by Alan Lau in my lab. And more recently, Nate Delaney-Bush and Emily Morgan actually constructed a model that basically explored why and how the human brain is able to adapt in this way. And, you know, one of the sort of central tenets of sort of Bayesian, both learning and inference, is that we track our certainty. And in this case, we're tracking our certainty about the predictive validity of the broader environment. And in this model, this certainty was basically used to influence the strength of our predictions. In other words, the degree to which we'd use our, in this case, our associative knowledge to generate predictions about the upcoming target. And what we showed was that on the trial-by-trial basis, this Bayesian adaptation model was able to explain modulation of the N400. And that this happens until people were pretty certain about the predictability of the environment, at which point the model does exactly what you expect it to do and what the brain does, in which case your prediction's actually mirroring that statistical structure. So Tori Sharp, a graduate student in our lab, basically took this paradigm to schizophrenia. And you can see that unlike the healthy controls, this is in the high predictability block following the low one, people with schizophrenia basically failed to produce the N400 effect, but they also, and what she also showed was that unlike the healthy adults, there was really kind of minimal use of these certainty principles to actually adapt on a trial-to-trial basis. And although we didn't explicitly model this, one possible explanation for this is that the reason that they weren't adapted is that instead of having this expectation for the environment to be sort of fairly stationary and then suddenly change, that patients had a more general expectation for gradual change. They didn't model this kind of clustered statistical environment in the same way as healthy controls. And so one possibility is that basically the failure to predict or use the broader situational context to predict may actually have implications for how healthy adults maintain their lexical representations. So just to remind you, we're going to, in general, produce very small prediction errors to words that are highly expected in a given context. In this case, it's sort of something like going to church, and basically you'll say the man went to confession, he confessed his sins to the priest. Larger error to something like church and largest to bell, even though these are broadly within context, basically by filtering it through your linguistic knowledge and through the event, you're going to get these kind of graded predictions. It suggests that, you know, it's really by having high certainty of the broader statistical structure and having these graded predictions, this is one way of maintaining these graded lexicosemantic representations, because of course lexicosemantic, at least I think of it this way, they really are just mapping structures between form and meaning. And so in schizophrenia, if there was a more uncertainty and not just uncertainty, but a sort of failure to use the broader situational context to sort of predict as strongly during language comprehension, and if you did have this equaling out of prediction errors, then in the presence of the uncertainty, that may actually lead to more fuzzy representations in which instead of being nicely distinguished like this, then there would be links even between words that only indirectly related. And the reason, you know, I think this is interesting is that it provides an explanation for something that we've seen and others have seen, and that is that in healthy adults, in highly automatic semantic priming situations where, well, actually this is not highly automatic, I'll show you that in a second, but when you've got sort of very short intervals between prime and target, then whereas healthy adults really don't show very much of an indirect priming effect. So if I give you grass priest versus bell priest, there's really not much difference between them. In people with schizophrenia, and particularly those with thought disorder, then you start to see for the very first time a larger priming effect than in healthy adults. And the standard explanation for this has usually been that it's due to an increase or wider spread of activation across memory. So the idea is that, if you get Bell, then that will basically activate semantic representations through lexical representations spread more widely. In healthy adults, it would just get here, and patients, it would get here, so that when you get Priest, you'll get a larger indirect priming effect. But the problem is you don't get a larger direct priming effect. And we've looked, and I haven't seen much evidence of that. And so it sort of seems a bit strange. Why would you get a large indirect priming effect but not direct priming effect? And I think that perhaps this sort of noisy lexical representation idea could begin to explain that, because what it would provide is a direct pathway from the input to lexical representations that are sort of actually more directly linked to the prime, so that when you get the target, you'd get this increased priming effect. And so in recent work, we wanted to look to see whether we could replicate this using a different technique, this time MEG as opposed to EEG, but this time sort of really look at it under really super highly automatic conditions, where basically you can see there's a 20 millisecond interval between prime and target, and where we're masking the prime. So people are hardly aware of the presence of the prime. So we're really cutting down all top-down predictive processing. We're really now trying to see whether we can really sort of see this increased, capture the lexical representations as activated directly by the bottom-up input. And once again, in the control group, you see very minimal indirect priming effect. In the schizophrenia group, for the very first time, you again see an indirect priming effect. And we also did this with fMRI. And this time, instead of seeing that reverse, that increase of activity to the unassociated, to the associated words, we now, under these very highly automatic circumstances, we're seeing basically, again, this increased indirect priming effect, once again localizing to these regions of left inferior anterior temporal cortex. So in summary, I sort of suggested to you that we have, that because of relatively uncertainty about a broader situation at any given time, patients may fail to use the broader situation context to generate top-down predictions. And that actually may lead to a failure to suppress lexicosemantic prediction error, particularly within the left ventral cortex, ventrotemporal cortex, that may account for some of the hyperactivation that we see in fMRI studies, but in combination with the uncertainty may actually have implications leading to noisier lexical representations. And so very briefly, I'm just going to ask whether any of these principles can, I'm just going to explore, first of all, the generalizability of these principles, and then some implications. And so, so far I've been talking to you mainly about ERP studies. As I said, in many of them we've been presenting inputs visually, but in a collaboration with Jesse Snedeker, and the person who led this paper was Hugh Ragliabati, also Nate Delaney-Bush in my lab. We used a very different paradigm. Reviewers didn't like this paradigm, but it was really a wonderful example of a disconnect between the psycholinguistic literature and the psychopathology literature, because it's actually really standard in the psycholinguistic literature. And it's a great paradigm. It's called the visual world paradigm. And people basically just hear commands, like they have a visual scene in front of them. That's why it's called the visual world paradigm, and and their eye movements are being monitored, and they're asked to do things. And in this case, they're asked to actually do actions. And so they might say, "Here, tickle the frog with a feather," and so they might tickle the little frog with the feather. And what this paradigm does is it sort of monitors where people look. It's actually got pretty good temporal resolution, because people can sort of look away, look towards the object sort of incrementally, depending on exactly when you're hearing the word. And it can give you a fairly good idea of how they're understanding the sentence as it unfolds in real time, this time auditorily. And to cut a sort of long story short, tickle the frog with the feather is actually ambiguous. You can actually use your finger to tickle a frog that's holding a feather or any old frog, or you can use a feather to tickle a frog. And you can really carefully manipulate different kinds of cues and in that way figure out from their eye movements, just simply as they're listening to these instructions, exactly how they're interpreting the sentence. And it turns out that healthy adults can use multiple different kinds of cues to disambiguate or to inform their interpretation. So this is a really nice direct way of looking at how we use different kinds of bottom-up as well as top-down cues to inform our interpretation of spoken language, really in the real world and the surface of doing action. And I don't have time to get into it now, but I encourage you to look at the paper because we found that whereas healthy individuals were able to use conversational context, such as, oh, what should we do now? Let's tickle the frog with a feather, in which case they were more likely to go with this interpretation. And we're able to use the general visual scene to inform their interpretation. We found that people with schizophrenia really did not do this in the same way as healthy adults. In contrast, they were actually able to use lexico-semantic cues as well as prosodic cues. I haven't represented that here, just completely normally. So we saw this complete dissociation. And the dissociation was really during online processing. If you waited a while, they were able to use these different high-level sources of context. So it was really the ability to use this broader sort of situational context to inform processing as it unfolded online. So that was, really interesting to us because it suggested that some of these principles might generalize, because over here you're using syntactic structures and phonology input, which is kind of different to what I've been talking to you about throughout this talk. I also think this might have some sort of more general implications for how we think about cognitive dysfunction in psychosis. And so, I think the kind of default way of thinking about certain things is that if you've got abnormalities at earlier perceptual levels, say at the sublexical level, then that sort of might cascade up to lead to abnormalities at the lexical level, event level, and finally the situation. So you might get something like this. But what I sort of suggested to you is that the problems may actually start out through the inability to rapidly mobilize our knowledge about the broader situations to inform language comprehension and perhaps production. And that may in turn lead to noisier lexical and possibly even sublexical representations. So I've been sort of alluding, as you probably gathered, I've mainly been talking about language processing, language comprehension. But I think there's a lot of face validity with the kinds of phenomena that we see, particularly in thought disordered people, in terms of the kind of tangential speech that you can sometimes see in production. Of course, in production, things are very, very different. Rather than, I've been talking about the prediction as being top down in production. That is the base, that's what you're doing. You're basically generating a speech plan based on your broader situational knowledge. But just as in perception, there's, this sort of whole thing this whole balance between bottom-up and top-down connections is not as clean-cut as sort of thinking about production as completely top-down and perception and comprehension as being bottom-up. Both have some of the other. And so key component of speech production is the ability to monitor, the ability to basically use feedback, both from the other speaker as well as from one's own, what one actually says, to actually modulate the speech plan as we produce it online. And it may be that this sort of chronic uncertainty at this high level representation may actually account for some of the tangentiality that we see in the speech produced by some patients. But I also want to emphasize, and I've, like many of you, I sort of started off looking at schizophrenia through the lens of thought disorder. But I really hope that this group doesn't only think about language and schizophrenia as to do with thought disorder. I mean, the problem is that language is not very well assessed in comprehension either. There's hardly any kind of systematic studies looking at comprehension, but whenever it has been looked at, people do really badly. And I think that it's really worth taking that seriously and thinking about language not only as a sort of cognitive faculty that we need to explore, but something that's going to have direct impact for everyday social communication, both in terms of production, but also in comprehension. And I just want to, I'm pretty sure I'm running out of time, so I just want to very briefly highlight some work recently done by Tori Sharp. Again, I've already highlighted her work now, very talented grad student in our lab, together with Lotte Schutt, who was a postdoc, and where we looked at lexical alignment. And we did it using a very, very simple task, but unlike many kind of tasks that we use in the laboratory, this was really a fun game, and it involved two people. But they very, very carefully manipulated the conditions such that as people alternated between simply naming pictures that appeared on the screen, unbeknownst to them, a few trials back, the experimenter had used a dispreferred name. So instead of saying rabbit, they would have said bunny. And then very implicitly, what happens is that healthy adults and children naturally align. And even though you would normally, when you see a picture of this, you would say rabbit. If you've heard someone else produce bunny, you will tend to align with them and also produce the word bunny, even though it's more infrequent. And so we're interested to see, whether people with schizophrenia would be able to align. And this is sort of relevant because it's sort of perfect example of sort of the mechanism of alignment are both driven by both bottom-up sort of priming mechanisms, but also by the use of situational context. In this case, the situation is the conversational partner, and so it's going to really it's thought to also engage top-down mentalizing. But actually, in this simple task, we found that patients and also people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, they align perfectly well, which was really kind of encouraging because it suggests that at least with this kind of simple communicative task, people were able to align and with their conversational partners. However, when Tori looked at the data sort of more carefully, we also got measures on two constructs, both production priming as well as a score of mentalizing. It was really interesting because within the schizophrenia group, we found that both predicted alignment. And so what we actually think is that the patients actually showed increased, as a group, showed increased sort of bottom-up priming activity and decreased mentalizing, and then the individual differences mirrored that. So it was almost like in schizophrenia, the decreased mentalizing combined with this increased lexical production priming basically combined to produce this atypical pattern of lexical alignment, which really is important because it makes me wonder what patients would do in a more complex task where there is the demand to switch from situational partner to situational partner, in which case you may fail to see this sort of relative compensation and you may see alignment impaired. And also, I think this way of thinking about the predictability of language in context has important implications for thinking about computational measures. We've heard about some of them during this seminar series, and currently our lab is collaborating with Lena's and also with Eric Tan's to basically quantify the predictability of words within context. And one of the things that Tori, this is once again that Tori Sharp wants to do, is to basically really look at how much of the more local versus global context they're able to use during speech production. And of course, we have sort of really nice language models that can provide assessments of predictability of each word in natural speech. And so with that, I'll thank you all. You know, I've spoken about some studies that we've done in our labs, but some of them stretched over many years. And so these are faces from a long time back that I'll thank you for your attention.
Excellent, Gina. Thank you very much. It was a very illuminating talk. Deb, are you able to bring up your screen and continue?
Yep, let me do that. That was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much, Gina. Okay, let me get to here. Okay, can everyone see my slides? Okay, very good. All right, it's really a pleasure to serve as a discussant here and to have an opportunity to catch up on what's happening in language and schizophrenia. This is something that I focused on a lot in the past, and I've checked in with it sporadically. So I'm going to just basically start by giving you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from with respect to this topic, and then I'm going to present 4 different classes of discussion questions, and we could take them one at a time, or I could put it all out there and then we could let people discuss. So we'll see how it goes. And I just wanted I love these images. These images were created by Richard McLean here, who wrote this book. He's a person living with schizophrenia. This is a lovely first person narrative of what it is to live with schizophrenia. And I actually met him and was at one point was using these images on my lab website. Okay, so why am I delighted to serve as a discussant today? Well, first, I have enthusiastically followed Gina Cooperberg's work since we were both introduced to each other as postdocs in Boston, and I really consider her a dear friend. And so I'm just so happy to be here to be able to support her talk like this. And at that time, as Lena mentioned, I had the privilege of postdocing with Phil Holtzman and Deborah Levy at the McLean Research Lab. And before that, I actually did an undergraduate honors thesis with Murray Alpert, who some of you may know at NYU Medical Center. And my first exposure to language and the study of language was actually in the context of language and schizophrenia in Murray Alpert's lab. And I credit this whole field for pushing me in the direction that I've gone in my career. And as also mentioned, I continue to study language and schizophrenia, but sporadically today, I'm more studying bilingual language processing. But interestingly, in many of the same ways, Gina is sort of coming at schizophrenia. My lab has been sort of moving in a more social direction, more contextualized direction. And my recent work has been with Veronica Whitford, Gillian O'Driscoll. I have trainees, Vegas Hodgins and Marco Sinaldi, and we're going to try to start up some studies. And I had been collaborating with Deborah Levy. She passed away recently and we were collaborating with other people like Randy Jameson and Charity Borgen on doing computational approaches to language. And this work is ongoing, so hopefully it will come to fruition in the coming years. And also I've had personal connections to people living with schizophrenia. And these connections infuse me with really maximal empathy for the barriers faced in daily life due to this condition. And I think that as language researchers, given how socially contextualized language is, this is like a real opportunity to translate what we do to actually help people. So just a moment to honor Deborah Levy and Phil Holtzman. All of you know their seminal work with the thought disorder index and the whole, which I came to as an undergraduate, and I was so privileged to be in their lab. And really, without that experience, I don't think I'd have the career that I have today. And when I was in their lab, and this was going on 20 years ago, I did a series of studies. I did one study looking at lexical ambiguity. I did another study with idiom processing, spoken language comprehension in terms of neighborhood density of words, relational conceptual combination. And across all of these studies, the conclusion 20 years ago is being upheld by more nuanced neuroscience measures of the kind Gina has been speaking about, which is this idea that not all is wrong in people with schizophrenia, right? There are certain aspects of bottom-up sort of lexical activation that seem to be intact. And what seems to be wrong is when things get more complicated and when prediction or contextual processing gets more distant or complex. And I think a work from many different labs, including my own work as a postdoc, Gina's lab, really is pointing at that. And of course, this has implications for lots of things. The genetic basis of thought disorder, which Deborah Levy was really passionate about, and so many other topics. Okay, and then just as a little plug, some of the work that we've been doing recently is really getting more about actual concrete tasks or skilled processes that really impact daily life in a way, right? So reading is a skill that's important for how we function in society and quality of life. So I find that my research in this field, when I think about this, I want to get in a more applied direction in a way that might sort of dovetail more with quality of life in people with schizophrenia. Okay, so as I said, I have crafted 4 different broad topics for discussion. Maybe what I'll do is I'll run through them quickly, and then because there's going to be, and I have families of questions. I always have so many questions. And I just want to emphasize that these questions and discussion points are not completely directed at Gina, right? So Gina has done so much in her lab to illuminate what's happening in language and schizophrenia. And what I think is really fantastic about Gina's work historically is how it doesn't just look at schizophrenia, it considers the healthy neurotypical literature, gets a base understanding of what's happening there, and then in a very sophisticated way, and then from that base looks to see what's happening in people with schizophrenia. And also another thing I'm so enamored of in Gina's work is how it doesn't focus on, it focuses across linguistic levels. So these questions that I have are really broad-based, and I don't want Gina to feel like she's got to answer all of them. I think all of us have to answer these questions. So the first general question is that the talk frames data in terms of activation versus suppression of prediction error, and that people with schizophrenia have intact bottom-up prediction error generation for any communication event, but that the problem is the failure to suppress prediction error. And therefore, prediction error hangs around longer in mind, and this can impact what happens downstream potentially. And then over time, what gets stored and updated in memory could be noisy, and then impact the next communication event and repeat. And I think this is a really compelling idea, right? This idea that what we do with language, we study it in a snapshot kind of way, but actually it's iterative, right? And it's ongoing. So I really appreciated what Gina said in her talk on this. But of course I have questions, right? So I have a family of questions, right? So one question I have is, if there is a failure to benefit from prior context, what triggers the prediction error? So maybe this is a semantic, is it error or activation? Is it suppression, activation? Perhaps I'm questioning that to some extent, and maybe that's not even answerable. But I also wondered about the idea of the generation of prediction error in a passive way versus an active way, right? So when we think about connectionist models of language processing, and I'm so impressed that Brian McWhinney is here, who's been so instrumental in this field of just basic language processing connectionist approaches. We know that there's lateral inhibition, there's active inhibition, and perhaps the prediction error that's being generated is very different, and there could be multiple kinds of prediction errors. And this leads me to wonder, are predictions at all linguistic levels the same? And then getting at this notion of over time, to the extent that these processes iterate over time, which I think is so fascinating, should we not expect progressive deterioration in people with schizophrenia? And do the data show that? And finally, if there are learning changes over time, and why wouldn't there be, perhaps people with schizophrenia are great at prediction, but the representational base from which they predict is altered. And how do we tease that apart? So I could stop here and let you all discuss now, or I can go on to the other questions. And I'm going to let Lena tell me what he wants me to do for that. Or Gina, Lena or Gina.
There is one thing that I really want to clarify, and that is just important because it directly relates to the first two of your questions. Yeah, would it be okay if I just
Absolutely.
clarify? Yeah,
go for it. Let's do it. Let's do it incrementally. Absolutely.
Okay. So I really want. This is like I'm just going to share my screen again.
Let me unshare mine. Hold on.
I want to emphasize something, and it's very, very important because this is new, not just to the, in fact, it's actually newer to the psycholinguistic community. So I've been sort of talking and thinking about prediction in relationship to the N400 for many years. And I think what most people in the psycholinguistics is saying that it's not a kind of conscious active thing, that it's very much part and parcel about how people produce language. So we know the brain is highly, highly sensitive to context. And we know this is not just in artificial sentence and discourse paradigms. We've seen this in just everyday speech, everyday reading. You can literally look at the amplitude of the N400 on each word. But I think what's really, really, really important is, and unfortunately the word prediction error means different things to different people. I really want to emphasize that I was very hesitant to kind of jump on the bandwagon of predictive coding. I wrote, one of the the most cited review on prediction in healthy adults. And I think I mentioned predictive coding right at the very end, because it's very easy to sort of basically make claims about probabilistic prediction in the brain and then basically say, oh, that means that it's predictive coding. But predictive coding is much more than, it really is a commitment to a particular kind of architecture, and it is a connectionist architecture, but it's a connectionist architecture. It's absolutely inherits all the features of incrementality, interactivity across levels of representation. But what distinguishes it from sort of classic interactive activation models is its basically commitment to this dual level at each level of representation. In other words, the way it actually operates is that it computes prediction error, not as a side effect or not even as a byproduct, but it literally is the information that is basically passed up from one level of the cortical hierarchy to the other. And it doesn't mean, and here's another unfortunate thing, the word error means very different. In psycholinguists, the word error means error-based processing. And you know what, that's a whole nother literature. I could have talked about that, like the P600 and so prediction error in predictive coding means the same as what it does in, say, how most connectionist models are taught, in learning. It's basically simply the information that comes from an incoming word that has not yet been explained by top-down information predictions that are produced at higher levels of the hierarchy. So it is implicitly produced, but it's produced as a means towards inference. And the only reason why, I guess, having SAM sort of simulate these kinds of effects so beautifully, as well as, and I will, as well as simulate, say, all the effects of lexical frequency, orthographic neighborhood, orthographic neighborhood, related anomaly effects, all of them can be explained within this model. And it's kind of been an eye-opener for me to think about it in this way, because it so naturally accounts for so much of the healthy adult data. I don't want to say it is the model that can account for most effects that I've seen, but what it also accounts for the time course too. And so, I guess that's why I kind of took this leap in starting to talk about predictive coding. But I really do, but even before talking about predictive coding, as a particular sort of architecture and particular algorithm, I think most people who talk about the effects of prediction on the N400 don't think of it as a kind of, it's top down, and but it's not an active conscious thing. It's basically part and parcel of communication.
Thank you. Sorry, my dog barked for a second.
Anyway, I guess I just want to kind of clarify that was how I was thinking about prediction error, that it's simply unpredicted information. So perhaps one thing that I didn't emphasize is the amplitude of the N400, here it's large, to a word that's unpredicted is exactly the same as to a word that violates a prediction if it's plausible. So it's not a prediction error as in kind of, oh my God, I got that wrong in the language sense. It's simply unpredicted lexico-semantic information that cannot be explained by the prior context. Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying that this is a model of forward-going activation to some extent, right? And that, so like in the classic distinction in psycholinguistics of sort of forward-going activation versus controlled subsequent reduction, is that all subsumed? It's just one thing in this model, or is this model more about the forward-going?
It's definitely not staged. It's definitely highly interactive. Okay. And it relies on, and there's both top down. I wish I had another. Let me just, I mean, I've got images that I can dig up which show you the sort of the architecture in more detail. But yeah, it's similar to interactive activation models in that there's huge both top down and bottom up processing, but the particular pattern of connections is such that basically the goal of the model is to produce prediction error, which is produced in these so-called error units. So the inhibition in the model comes from switching off the prediction error. So once each level of the model or each level of the cortex, and it's parallel. So as it is converging on the correct representation, because the prediction error induces the state at each level to sort of change from iteration 1 or time point 1 to time point 2, then it's very much a dynamic model. This is then switching off the prediction error. So over time, that's why you're going to get prediction error minimized and the representations sort of converging. And so it's a way of basically approximating inference. So basically each level is trying to infer the input received from the level below. And it's doing that through this continuous reduction of error. So it sort of subsumes some of that stuff, but it does it in a different way that's discussed in sort of classic connectionism. But it's a type of connectionist model, but with a particular algorithm and pattern of connections. And the other thing to say about that is that it's biologically plausible, because there is so much interactivity. So I wouldn't say it's just a bottom-up model. It commits to a huge amount of interactivity across levels of representation, which is something, of course, that language people talk about all the time, but actually in many models isn't actually so well instantiated, except the older ones. And the other way in which it's biologically plausible is that unlike many models where the inhibition comes at a lateral level within levels, the inhibition is actually coming between levels. Again, that's that's sort of more biologically plausible than some of the sort of classic ones where the classic models where you're seeing basically that sort of the inhibition had to be superimposed in order to basically get the model to shut down. Here, it's basically a natural part of the algorithm.
Okay, so I'm going to, there's a question in the chat that's relevant, that is really interesting by Venkat, who says there is a view, or maybe he wants to say it himself, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. Thanks, Gina. It's an excellent talk. I learned a lot. Very, very interesting. My question is, there is a view that the predictive processing framework might have some limits in explaining how thought is generated, especially the generality of the thought in terms of how we can move across several scales of either in space or in time, and then incorporating abstraction, so on and so forth. Essentially, it is if I have to generate a free thought, it's more like a free association. What is the prediction error and how the predictive processing framework could explain the generation of thought? So that is one component of my curiosity. And given your excellent work and many original publications related to N400, whether there is any relationship between such free associations and N400, and if so, its relevance in schizophrenia. Thank you.
Okay, so I think to the first part of your question, I will say absolutely, I have no idea. I don't think, to be able to sort of speculate on the role of prediction coding or prediction error in thought, I think is kind of goes beyond my pay grade. I don't think, I really don't think I can even speculate about that. I think we know nothing about human thought without, and I guess the nearest I can get there, okay, the very nearest I can get there, and this is, I hope this is nothing like, is I will sort of basically say, one of the most exciting things in my lab recently has been, for example, this work in which we've used MEG to basically, let me see if I can. This is the work that I mentioned by sort of Lin Wang. So maybe this could vaguely speak to what you're saying. So remember, there's multiple components to a predictive coding or any predictive framework, in that what it assumes is that because of these top-down connections from levels of cortex that are representing information at a longer spatiotemporal scale, there's this continuous feedback activity, and if they arrive before the bottom-up input comes in, predictions, probabilistic predictions, not all or nothing predictions, based on, I mean, here it is an all or nothing prediction because it's so constraining, but obviously the N400 is graded, and so we think these predictions are probabilistic. But one of the things that had eluded many people was how to actually capture the representational structure of the predictions themselves. And I guess that kind of vaguely gets into sort of what is thought, because at this point, after hearing or seeing in the crib, there was a little, you haven't actually gotten baby yet. Yet the idea is that the comprehender may have something in mind that resembles a baby. And so the ability to be able to decode this, and what they did was we used a sort of simple pairing paradigm. So we basically found that patterns, the spatial patterns of activation that we could basically decode from the surface of the skull, were more similar to in sentences that predicted baby. And because it was MEG, we were basically able to disentangle this from the prior context. We're basically measuring activity where there was no bottom-up input. And also we carried out a whole bunch of control analyses to show that it wasn't produced by the previous word. So we were basically able to decode and extract spatial patterns of similarity that were specific to the word baby, as opposed to, say, the word refrigerator in other also predictable sentences. And what we think is that spatial patterns basically represent sort of widely distributed semantic features, because they were sort of picked up actually at the surface of the scalp using MEG, which, but what was also, and probably the most cool part, was that there were also, and this did localize to certain regions, parts of the brain that picked up unique temporal patterns of activity, again, in the space before they'd actually heard baby, but which was specific to the prediction of the particular word, baby. And so the spatial, the temporal patterns were more similar when people predicted baby than, say, in another sentence where they predicted fridge. And we found that these temporal patterns did localize to particular regions of the temporal lobe. And what we actually speculated is that these temporal patterns are actually what are doing the binding of these distributed features, because there's nothing in, you know, I don't think people think that literally is a little baby area in the brain. I mean, the representation we have of a baby is going to be kind of round and human and kicking and crying. And there's a lot of sort of evidence that those representations are very broadly represented and you know, highly distributed. But what was sort of really interesting is that that it may be that certain regions or hubs actually play a role in binding these, possibly through these unique temporal patterns. And I also want to highlight, you know, in other work we've shown in a recent study in J Neuroscience, is that we could isolate sort of patterns of activity before input actually was encountered. We could also do that and decode animate versus inanimate features. So if you have a context that say, you know, I'm going to talk with, it's unlikely you're going to talk with a chair, which is inanimate, but there's, you know, so there's verbs and context that constrain for animate versus inanimate things. So I guess, you know, I wouldn't say predictive coding particularly and prediction error, I don't know how that would impact, because remember, prediction error is by definition, the prediction error is the difference between what you've predicted and what you've actually got, you know, from the bottom-up input. It's not one of, you know, it's not the prediction, it's not the bottom-up input, it's the difference in, it's simply the unpredicted input that's basically passed to higher levels. But to the degree that, you know, the generation of top-down predictions in the absence of bottom-up input could be thought to represent human thought, then you know, one of the things that we're looking, you know, at now is, you know, whether we can use other sort of way, you know, other ways, like, so, you know, other ways of basically decoding and having a look at this sort of information in the absence of bottom-up input. And it may be that that has some implications for schizophrenia.
I think there are a couple of other questions in the chat related to the issue of prediction error. And I had other questions, but we could stay here if this is what people are interested in. So Brian McWhinney had an interesting comment in the chat.
Yeah, sure. Oh, thank you. Boy, this is really remarkable stuff. There's so many great ideas here, trying to put it all together, you know, in my own little mind. I don't know, too many prediction error in my mind, I guess, about all the findings and how they relate. I guess I'm still probably back at the stage you were before you totally bought into prediction error.
Predictive coding.
Certainly there's no question that it is going on, but I just don't know whether this particular finding for schizophrenics and the N400 couldn't also be due to their learning to not react to these problematic types of, you know, I take my coffee with sugar and dog, you know, the Martakutis one.
Yeah,
you know,
I want, you know, one of the unfortunate things that happened with the N400 is this, that damn sentence is so famous, and it shouldn't be, because it's extremely misleading.
Yeah.
So in science, what we have is we have this primacy effect. Because the N400 was first described to anomalies, people thought of it as an anomaly detector, but it's not. It's the N400 is usually seen to completely plausible, but it's a default response to things.
Right. I don't believe. Yeah, I don't see it as an anomaly. I see it as competition, basically. But
so yeah.
I think this question gets at what I was asking too, which is that if the process is iterative and the representational base changes over time, maybe people are more willing to accept a violation, like that's compatible.
Yeah, so once again, I just want to emphasize that, say a larger N400 to a congruous but plausible input would produce a larger prediction error, even though there is absolutely no violation. It would be just to a word in isolation, would be, basically would be large. But I guess I really want to sort of step back a bit. I had very little time in this talk. And what I talked about was the first 300 to 500 milliseconds of language what's happening to an incoming word in the light of prior predictions that we can basically detect, model, localize, and sort of trying to look at the literature on the N400 in schizophrenia, which is not a huge literature, through that lens. And I guess what I was, but there is a whole other dimension which I didn't even begin to sort of get time to talk about, and that is this: that there's life that goes on beyond the N400. And so one of the things that we've been very interested, which I think directly speaks to your question, Brian, is basically what is the response of the human brain to actual errors, to actual anomalies. And the irony about the original study by Kutas and Hilliard with the tea and dog is that in addition to the N400, they saw a massive late posterior positivity effect. And, so, towards the beginning of my whole sort of career in psycholinguistics, what we've basically shown is that this, the P600, this late posterior positivity effect, at that time, people thought it was only a response to sort of syntactic violations and syntactic errors. But in fact, it's seen to all sorts of linguistic errors. And recent work, Trevor Brothers in my lab, has basically shown that it can even account for individual differences in error monitoring. And so, so am I trying to say that all of language can be kind of accounted? So what I'm trying to do is distinguish that kind of late posterior positivity as a true response to sort of the reanalysis that you get when you get errors from something like the N400, which is really not thought of so much as an error, as a psycholinguistic kind of error.
I think the question is whether in schizophrenia there is some kind of a learned function that after having many, well, first of all, there's all these thoughts that are going on in the mind of a person with schizophrenia that may be leading them to accept all sorts of discrepant or divergent associations, which is close to what you were saying with your rather loose, talking about loose semantic memory and a lot of crossing, that may be something that has a different time course rather than the exact moment of processing, but there develops over time a lack of reactivity to this particular configuration. Let me put it that way.
When you say lack of reactivity, what?
Right. So they're not showing the strong in N400.
But they are in many situations. So what I'm trying to say is basically they show a larger N400 to basically expected stuff, but a smaller N400 to sort of at least discourse incongruous stuff.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on sort of which way you look at it. But
that's where you broke the two apart. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess for me that it. So I think one of the reasons why I
But I think there is
to think of
consonant, yeah.
why I kind of begun to think about sort of the loosening of associations that you see in only some people with schizophrenia as a long-term consequence of impaired sort of higher level prediction is simply because you don't see it in many people with schizophrenia, whereas you do. So many of the many of the experiments that I talked about, we saw no difference between thought disordered and non-thought disordered. And so I think sort of in line with exactly what you're saying, I think, you know, that I guess one of the ways that hopefully became apparent from the talk that I've been thinking about it is that instead of there being this bottom-up disturbance that cascades up to lead to higher level disturbances, instead of you starting out with abnormal lexical representations, that perhaps, and this is, you know, that perhaps it might be a longer term consequence of this impairment in using high level.
Right, yeah, no, I think we're on the same page. Exactly to figure it out is right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right, good.
But I guess it does couch it as part of a neurodevelopmental disorder. And I think, you know, the thing that I think about in schizophrenia is that it's developmental, it's neurodevelopmental, but it onsets not in childhood, it onsets after people have already acquired language. And although there may be, of course, there's a huge amount of work that still needs to be done in the prodrome and before that, you know, there's some additional insult that's going to basically happen in young adulthood that's going to lead to decompensation. And also, speaking to Deb's point, I think it would be really interesting to look at the longer term, time course of particular symptoms such as—
I mean, acute versus chronic and time course and all that would be great, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I want to move to a next question, which is related actually. So I'm going to share my screen again, if I can do this successfully. Okay, and this, I had seen an earlier version of Gina's talk, but I'm going to ask a question because I think this talk might address it and we could just talk about it. I thought it was interesting. So the talk nicely establishes a prediction error framework for a subset of the language pipeline, lexical processing and isolation versus extended context of different sorts, discourse, interpersonal, etc., and leads to a reasonable hypothesis that offering cognitive training to strengthen this general mechanism could improve communication throughout the pipeline in people with schizophrenia. So, so my family of questions here is, what next empirical steps would researchers have to take to build this bridge, you know, to translate and actually try to improve lives of people, right? And what can we learn from the literature on cognitive brain training and neurotypical people that would bear on this endeavor? And what can we learn from the literature on social skills training in people with schizophrenia that would bear on this endeavor? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and let you all discuss.
This is very thought-provoking. Can I start with some comments on that? I think this is the direction we need to move in many ways, because hypotheses, which are very interesting, needs to be experimentally shown to be helpful, useful for treatment as well. I think this is the very important step. And one thought that comes to me from this very extensive work that you've done, Gina, and all the discussion that followed is, can we extend the thinking in predictive processing to what the agent, the patient, does after having a situation where context is poorly developed or predictive errors are recurrent? What does the agent do when in this situation? What does the person with this kind of problem does? In other words, what is the active inference equivalent of this? Is there any actions that people do to reduce this over time? And what actions are helpful and what actions are not? Because that will really inform us what kind of training cognitively, what kind of behavioral paradigms we should really think about in solving this problem. So extending from predictive error to active inference will be a very important aspect of this work, I guess.
So I will say that, actually predictive coding doesn't even need, I mean, it is a kind of the very fact that each level is reconstructing. The whole idea is that each level of the hierarchy is reconstructing and predicting information at the level below in order to try and explain the bottom-up input. And then that difference gets passed to the level above, which induces changes in state and so forth. And each level of the hierarchy is doing that until prediction error is minimized. And so in a sense, that is a type of active inference, even on the part of the comprehender. But I think what you're speaking to is basically whether predictive coding can also explain production, and whether it can explain, basically people conversing. And that, of course, is a $1 million question. I mean, I will say that, all the basically forward modeling in motor movement is based on the idea that, even ahead of carrying out a movement, then basically you're predicting your own action plan. And I've speculated in a review with Meredith Brown that this may be happening in production, but there's not a whole lot of very good direct evidence for that. I think it's a plausible hypothesis, because it strikes me that if something like that is so well established during motor action, then why wouldn't you be doing that at multiple levels of representation during production? But even more sort of interestingly is basically when you think of dialogue, you're not just trying to reduce your own prediction error, you're also trying to reduce the prediction error of the person you're conversing with, in order that basically you can have an effective dialogue. And I think it would be like super interesting to begin to explore those phenomena.
Yeah.
Really difficult to control experimentally. But I mean, yeah, this is the kind of stuff that makes me sort of get very excited, but also a bit kind of mind-blowing when you sort of really think about exactly what's going on. I think you'd have to do quite a lot of behavioral work first. And yeah, it's just very, very difficult to explore. But yeah, thinking about language in communicative context makes so much sense, because it's not like you're only trying to reduce the prediction error of your own brain. The whole point of comprehension is you're trying to infer the message that the other person is trying to communicate. And the whole point of production is you're trying to make that as easy as possible. And so when you think of that as sort of this joint inference, then it becomes really kind of both obvious, but incredibly mind-blowingly complicated. There's this really crazy paper by Frith and Friston about interactive communication through, what was it? Songbirds or something like that. And if you, I mean, I take it with a huge grain of salt, but it sort of reminds me of that sort of that whole endeavor of, trying to think of a single communicative system. It's been we do, of course, in dialogue, we're constantly predicting each other's words and phrases. That's been very well established. My colleague at Tufts, JP de Ruyter, has sort of shown that really carefully. And you can also show that you start to predict what the other person is going to say even before they finish saying it. So, I mean, I think there's some interesting work to be done, but that's different from then, just predictive processing is unambiguous in language processing. I mean, actually tying it to a very particular computational framework is sort of a step further, and I think we're a long way away from being able to really model that in dialogue.
Well, there are interesting questions coming, so I don't want to take all the time, but just one comment. You showed several hierarchy of predictive processing, and to me it occurs that the amount of sharing between two people across these different levels is very different. The context is shared much more because both of us are in the same environment, same room. When it comes to lexical choices we make, there's less shared. So there is something about social communication, as you mentioned, which really produces the schizophrenia type of language pathology. This needs to be really explored more. So with that, I'll keep quiet.
Yeah, and the other thing, like when we're thinking about what's going to produce so we can study the pathology, the staying on topics thing, I think is an important one. And yeah, I also want to speak to the idea of sort of intervention, because I'll just, again, very, very briefly bring up an extra slide that I have, because I didn't get time to sort of put this in, but so as I said, this kind of idea of sort of tackling at both ends, I think sort of is potentially important. I guess the alignment gets a little bit on conversation, but I think, you know, that one sort of traditional way of focusing on cognitive and even certain social aspects of rehabilitation is to start bottom up and do sort of these phonemic discrimination tasks and things like that, and then hope that that will generalize. And maybe it will, but I guess, you know, sort of really thinking of this sort of highly interactive architecture in which basically there's top down and bottom up flow of information in parallel at all levels of the hierarchy at once, really sort of makes me think that if we're going to do sort of cognitive remediation, then we need to do these things in parallel, that basically doing it out of context without looking at people's overall goals, community goals, would be a mistake, and that really we should be thinking of trying to tackle any aspect of remediation synergistically, rather than just start at the bottom up or start at the bottom or start at the top. That really together, that at least within this framework, that might be most fruitful.
Okay, thank you for that. Roberto has his hand up if he would like to ask his question. And then there were some questions in the chat if people want to unmute themselves later.
All right, thank you very much. Gina, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. You summarized your work very nicely. I really enjoyed it. I'm going more directly to the question, a theoretical question between your formal definition of predictive coding and the ensuing application to language comprehension. I mean, I understand from active inference that predictive coding is a special case that only accounts for the variational free energy, I mean the perception, the minimization of variational free energy, whereas in active inference, language production can be regarded as a minimization of expected free energy, because action is what comes from active inference. In predictive coding, we don't have, theoretically speaking, the notion of action. Therefore, language production is not within the vernacular definition of predictive coding. And however, in predictive processing, that might include or not predictive coding, we can speak about prediction errors, even though we might not conform to the formal definition of active inference. But my question here is, based upon your theoretical perspective, your predictive coding approach is based upon the definition of active inference, or?
No, I know. I should have, you know, it's funny, I would never have to do this to a psycholinguistic audience, but I was forgetting, Friston has basically, hugely, so there's active inference, and there's free energy, and there's Rao and Ballard, which is, so basically in sort of 1999, Rao and Ballard published a seminal study in Nature Neuroscience, basically showing that predictive coding, which is, as I say, a really very quite specific architecture with particular connections across levels of representation, and a commitment to the idea that at each level of representation, there are two functionally distinct units, state and error units. And that the prediction error, the unpredicted information that is passed from the level above, basically gets passed up. And meanwhile, each level of the hierarchy is trying to minimize the prediction error of the level below, and this proceeds hierarchically. This is Rao and Ballard's algorithm. What Carl Friston did was he took this and made and showed that some of those mathematical assumptions could, under certain circumstances and certain assumptions, could be explained within this much, much broader free energy active inference framework, which I don't understand, and I won't even pretend to. What I do understand is the predictive coding algorithm and network structure that was originally described and has been enormously successful in the visual system, as well as in other perceptual areas. There is no computational model that, you know, I can take that does Carl Friston's kind of magic. There really isn't. There are models that have been developed in the visual system that can basically show that one can simulate. What was really wonderful about this is that I was thinking about all this stuff, and I was thinking, gosh, you know, I'd love to talk about this as prediction error, but I really got no direct evidence. But, you know, all these lovely neural measures that I've known and loved for so many years. And it was only when I really started rereading Rao and Ballard and trying to understand it, and then spoke to Mike Sprackling, who's been sort of working on these algorithms for many years, completely outside free energy, just trying to understand what predictive coding can tell us about the visual system. And then when I was chatting to him, realized that we could actually adapt this architecture and basically make a model that has toy, semantic representations, orthographic, lexical, wire the model just as exactly in the same principles that were used by Rao and Ballard, and ask whether the simulations using this model can basically produce the N400, but much more important, whether it's sort of simulated, where you can simulate all the effects of so many lexical variables and so many contextual effects and their interactions. What's novel about this particular computational model is that it doesn't, I'm not pretending that it's doing anything that it isn't. What I am saying is that it's basically taking an architecture that was described and the principles that were described in the visual system and showing that it can account for many aspects of, like, you know, decades of observed data. I think that's very exciting. I don't want to make any, you know, I really want to be careful. I'm not talking about I'm not talking about free energy framework. I'm just talking about plain old Rao and Ballard predictive coding.
Yeah. Can I make a follow-up question?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, no, I totally agree, because I was just paying careful attention to your data and what you presented. And that was my question, whether the predictive coding approach you assume in your work is based upon the generalized active inference. However, I noticed a few concept or idea that you brought up in your presentation that points more towards active inference than towards the original work of Rao and Ballard in 1999, which with all equations we can explain in terms of active inference. I mean, for example,
yeah, that would be super exciting. No, so you're right, like the speculation about dialogue and Lena's question, it would be really exciting, but I haven't been, I mean, but the rest is more sort of speculation. But actually there is one aspect that did make me think a little bit more about perhaps what you're talking about, and that, you know, so one of the sort of Fristonian thing is, you know, this whole idea of precision weighting and all the rest of that. One could think of basically our use of situational context as exerting some kind of precision weighting. You know, I prefer to actually sort of think about it more concretely than that, but one could think of it within that framework. But we haven't modeled that.
Okay, yeah. I think we should move. There's other questions in the chat that are related, if you don't mind, because this sounds like this could go for a while. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
That is an implicit okay. So Peter Little has a very interesting question in the chat that I think is related to this in a way. This idea that are these mechanisms fundamental, specific to language? Do they extend to other domains? I don't know if Peter Little wants to ask that and unmute himself.
Yeah, okay. I mean, you probably might have expected I'd ask that, because that's been my preoccupation for about 35 years. But it starts from the clinical observation that, well, disorganized phenomena are seen across different domains: affect, motor action, language. And so the empirical evidence sort of suggests that they're related. And the reason I'm asking this again now, having first asked it many years ago in a different framework, is you as I understood what you're saying, that the N400 abnormality in schizophrenia is scarcely detectable, or maybe even not detectable at all, until you bring in the, if you like, the higher level of the contextual, well, using the context to shape the prediction. I think that's, you know, that's what I've understood from the evidence you presented. And so the fact that it's this, you know, it's when you go to the higher level of integrating the context that you start to see the problem with schizophrenia, that seems to me, you know, that makes me re-ask my 30 or 40-year-old question: how are these different domains of disorganized affect, language, and motor activity
that's a really
behavior?
interesting question. For those of you who aren't familiar with the N400, please know that it's not only a language phenomenon. It had, you know, with a more anterior scalp distribution, therefore probably with slightly different sources. But the way it behaves in relationship to context is very similar. When you basically get visually presented, anything meaningful will evoke an N400. And you know, meaningful images, scenes, movies that are predictable versus there's been less work in that way, but you know, we've done a whole bunch of studies using some simple movie clips where basically you can show that the N400 is highly sensitive to context. And so yeah, I do think many of these I mean, the thing about something like predictive coding is that, of course, it's a computational algorithm and architecture that's neurally plausible, that can be sort of thought about as being instantiated at multiple levels of representation and multiple levels of cortex, operating, of course, on very different representations. But one of the things that I find exciting about thinking within this broad framework is that it begins to sort of link sort of these more general computational principles with language processing. As I said, you know, for example, this algorithm we took, I mean, no one told us to wire it up that way. You know, we gave it the representations it needed, but, you know, the fact that it's producing sort of phenomena that we see, you know, empirically is exciting to me. But yeah, no, I've never thought of language and schizophrenia as being, you know, its own thing. I've always thought of it as providing a window into more general the thought disorganization. And actually some of our, yeah, we've actually done, yeah, with Tatiana Sitnikova, some work showing that basically disorganization of action can basically be predicted by certain aspects of, yeah, so yeah, basically by the N400 effect in these real world visual contexts.
Good, thanks very much.
Getting thirsty.
Oh, sorry, your question reminds me of one of what your answer reminds me of one of my questions that I just had that I'm going to share, which is something that's always puzzled me, that the study of language and schizophrenia is rarely considered as a classic special population within the psychology and cognitive neuroscience of language, in contrast with aphasia, dyslexia. Why do you think this is? And what are general language researchers missing by not thinking about schizophrenia? And then this leads me to wonder, are these communication issues that we see even specific to schizophrenia? If you put neurotypical people under different task conditions or cognitive conditions, would we reproduce the same kinds of effects? So I don't know your thoughts on that.
Like, so, oh, you're okay.
Or anyone can discuss.
There's so little work doing this really systematically, especially in language. I mean, there's no doubt that many other, and that's the whole premise of RDoC and everything, right? There's no doubt that many other cognitive deficits and or cognitive abnormalities are shared with other populations. It would be really interesting to do sort of head-on-head comparisons. You know, I really like your first question, which is something that I thought about a lot, which is sort of why the study of language, you know, is relatively boutique in schizophrenia, whereas in aphasia. Autism is another one. And I think that's to do with, you know, where it's mainstream. And I think that really is to do with when it onsets. You know, your typical language researcher or clinician is going to study language in older adults, elderly adults, and dementia and aphasias, and even though they're also characterized by more general cognitive deficits. And then, of course, they're going to see children with autism, SLI, and all the rest. But historically, they're not going to be seeing people with schizophrenia where it's sort of onsetting at this sort of mid-age, that these people, it's just never been part of the tradition. Another thing that bothers me is we really don't know much about comprehension in schizophrenia. There's so much stuff in other aspects of cognitive processing. We know they have impaired executive function, working memory. We know quite a lot about that. Basic kind of everyday comprehension assessments are rare in schizophrenia. I mean, I'm talking about from a clinical point of view, not from a kind of cognitive neuroscience point of view. And but when you speak to people who do cognitive rehabilitation, then it's really strange, because all of the outcome measures are, in terms of comprehension, they're about how people identify others who've just spoken to them, how they pick up the phone and have a conversation, and all of this stuff. And it's hardly studied. And I think that's partly historical, to do with the age of onset. I think also the other thing is that because, you know, extreme thought disorder is so prominent in people with schizophrenia, I think our field tends to be driven by production. And yeah, people who do processing are like me, they're looking at sort of experimental, phenomena and trying to pin down mechanism. But I think, we've sort of ignored the fact that in many cases, people with schizophrenia, especially in situation, everyday context, when they're having to switch from person to person, have fast-paced conversations where, the kinds of interactions where a sort of, I think it's going to be particularly important to be able to use your situational context to be able to proactively anticipate what's going to be happening next. That is we know very little about that and how that impacts day-to-day life in schizophrenia.
Right. I wonder too if in psycholinguistics or the study of language, we're so concerned with snapshots of very small pieces of the pipeline that really schizophrenia is a macro disorder, right? It's a disorder of the interaction of systems in a way, right? And that's just harder to base a clean, neat and tidy experimental study on, right? So I think that could be part of it as well.
Yeah, to that I've always said then, language is your system, right? Because I mean, I've never thought of language as very particularly modular ever, I believe in levels of representation. I believe in sort of huge interactivity and bottom up and top down feedback. And all of these, by the way, are sort of inherited by something like predictive coding. But it, I think of it as actually a really good model system to be able to understand interactions between high level and low level stuff. But yeah, I think and I find it very difficult to think of that in isolation of more general cognitive facilities like working memory and things like that. So, and I guess that's what made me think more about kind of computational constructs rather than, particular brain areas that do X, Y, and Z. But you're right, it's complex. And I think that scares some people.
It's for the brave. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Lena because I think we only have 2 minutes left and he might want to have some closing comments. But I'm so grateful for this opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Deb. Thank you, Gina. The most difficult part of my job every month is closing this meeting. It's a very interesting discussion that goes on, and I find myself to be the villain who closes all these interesting discussions. So we can go on, but the good news is this will continue in a slightly different format next year, and I hope all of you can continue to participate and engage in interesting discussions. So let me thank Gina for this wonderful session. This is very thought-provoking. I think all of us are left with very interesting questions, and we're rethinking our own work after Gina's talk. And that's exactly the kind of impact that we want from these sessions. So thank you very much, Gina. It just reminds me how much we need to inspire the general language researchers as well in order to take schizophrenia as a case of study, because there's quite a lot of good things that will come out of inspiring the broader group into taking this as an interest. And I also endorse the comment from Brian that we are setting up this network and the databases only for this purpose, and we need to really advertise it for broader so more people can use it. So thanks everyone again for joining us, and please stay in touch and look forward for more newsletters and emails.
I'm saying that the treatment team meetings should be virtual.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's what I mentioned. Is a number of people ask. That's not me talking, definitely not. Anyway, I would say these meetings will remain virtual for next year, monthly meetings. And also the time will be slightly different because we have a lot of people from the other side of the world, especially from the East and Australia, who are not able to join us because of the time that we chose. So there will be some change. We'll find something that is attendable for everyone. And we may have to rotate some of these timings as well next year. So please stay tuned for that. And thanks again. Please join me in clapping your hands for Gina one more time, and Deb as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Gina. This recording
Bye, everyone.
will be both soon. Thanks. Bye.
Hi.
Okay, so let me stop the